by nature, every one of us starts with ourselves. So that's always our starting point. And the result of that in community will always lead to conflict. You know, when you start with yourself and I start with myself, we're gonna have a bust up.
Welcome to the Christian Education Podcast. My name is Paul Matthews, and today it's my absolute delight to have Simon Matthews returning as a guest. It's his third discussion with me, and this actually marks 3 whole episodes that I've managed to go without calling him Dad on air, so I'm actually pretty happy with that. It should go without saying that I'm really deeply indebted to this man when it comes to my theology of and practice within Christian education, and it's always a pleasure to sit down and speak with him. I said at the end of last year that I had 2 focal points for this year, if you can have 2 focal points. I wanted to look at 2 different things. I want to do some good thinking about teacher burnout, and I want to look at managing conflict in schools. And today we're going to focus on conflict, but I wonder if we aren't at least tangentially also looking at burnout when we look at conflict. A number of ex-teachers I speak of being in a hostile or dysfunctional work environment, and that leading to them leaving the profession. Of course, you can't draw a straight line between conflict and burnout always, but I'd imagine if you were to ask all the teachers that left the teaching profession why they left, well, conflict would be a significant slice of the pie. In this discussion, we look at how we as image bearers, as members of a Christian community, can approach conflict. Of course, conflict is inevitable. It's also an opportunity for growth and something that we can move through to the glory of God and for the good of one another. Just a note here, we're actually going to dive in halfway through the discussion. We talked for a lot longer, but I ended up giving a bit of a haircut. As always, know that Simon and I prayed for you before we hit record. We prayed that when conflict inevitably arises, that you would not waste the opportunity to learn the valuable lesson God teaches you and to walk in the good works God prepares for you. I know you're a man who's dealt with conflict in your time as a school leader, and in some ways that's no surprise. Anyone who's been at a school will know that there just is conflict. That's a natural result of people working together. I want to launch in through a proverb. Last year I tried to read 1 chapter of Proverbs every day. There's 31 chapters. Often months have 31 days. And so it's a really natural fit. One of the proverbs that kept standing out to me over and over again is Proverbs 14:4. It says, "Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but the abundance of crops comes by the strength of the ox." And so there's that idea there that if you want a nice, clean manger, you can get that, but without any oxen. All right, you can't have any of these big heavy movers. But if we actually desire to do something big, like reap an abundant harvest or maybe have a thriving Christian school, there's actually going to be some mess involved. Now the question is this, Simon, do you think that conflict is an inevitable part of Christian education?
Look, I do. I think it's an inevitable part of any community. You get more than 2 people in a room, you're going to have conflict. And so family, church, school, footy club, local fire brigade, whatever. It is inevitable. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it is inevitable. And the reason for that, and, this is not rocket science, but the reason for that is because by nature, every one of us starts with ourselves. So that's always our starting point. And the result of that in community will always lead to conflict. When you start with yourself and I start with myself, we're gonna have a bust up. So yes, it's inevitable, and there can be a bit of doom and gloom in that. You can drop your head and, But I think the thing we want to keep saying to ourselves and to each other is that even though it's an inevitable part of Christian community, we actually can have a hopeful response to it. That's the thing. Jesus dealt with in complete and full terms. He dealt with our greatest conflicts, which of course was our enmity with God. So he's done that, and he's made a way that allows us in humility and in obedience in Christ and under the power of his Spirit to daily deal with the conflict that we experience with each other. So that's our hopeful response to the inevitable. So we certainly don't go looking for it, but every time it comes, and we don't have to wait long, we can say, okay, God has made a way. And it's our hopeful response to be able to go, thank you, Jesus. We now take hold of that which God has worked out through you, Jesus, to bring resolution to this.
Let's press pause on this discussion for a moment. Over the last year or so, some of you have been asking how you can support the Christian Education Podcast. Well, let me give you 3 ways, all starting with S. The first S is simply to subscribe. So that's just a setting on your podcast app, actually. And if you do that, that helps me probably more than you think. The second S is to share. So if you really love one of these episodes, why not push it through your social media? You can even send it to an educator directly if you think they'd benefit from it. And the third S is to get in touch. Now, I know that's not an S, but let's not get bogged down in the details here. If there's someone who you think would make a great contribution to this podcast, why not send me their name? Hey, you can even dob in yourself. That's just fine by me. So if you're able to do those 3 S's to subscribe, share, and get in touch, well, that will help me do the very same thing that we're all trying to do here, to see God's kingdom grow through Christian education. Having said that, let's get back to the discussion. It is interesting to think about it being an inevitable part of a community, only because so many of us are so scared of conflict. We can have this big knee-jerk reaction. Many of us have the tendency to actually avoid conflict at all costs. And in some ways, that's just kicking the can down the road, isn't it? Because you end up putting up with more and more and more until you finally go off like Mount Vesuvius. You explode everywhere, or or you just leave the job, or this sort of thing. We can flee from conflict so easily. Do you think conflict, given that we've said it's probably inevitable, the second natural question, I think, is it always negative?
Look, I think that's a great question. And look, what you described is my natural tendency. I hate conflict. I will avoid it like the plague. But as you say, what I then do is I actually head off into really unhealthy other behaviours, avoidance, people-pleasing, that sort of stuff. Look, I think that there are 2 scriptures which are really helpful in this. And I share these not because you go licking your chops ready and waiting for the next Barney. You're not actually looking for conflict, but it's going to come. So when it does, where do we go? It's a verse we all know, Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So the first thing we've got to say in that one is, okay, God, I'm in the midst of conflict. I don't want to be, but I am. Would you please work this out for good, my good, the good of my community, the good of the other involved? Would you please work that out? So I think that's our starting point, that we can almost shun conflict and see it as avoid at all costs. And again, we like Paul's exhortation to the churches. We want to be a people of peace. That's our starting point. But when we're not, what do? We go to the one who uses all things, who works out all things for our good. So that's the first thing. The second is a really helpful, I think, reading from 1 Corinthians 10, just the end of chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11, where Paul says this. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Give no offence to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone and everything, not seeking my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. At Cairo Christian School, we've spent some time doing some training through a crowd called Peacewise Australia, and their little catch cry is great, and I find it really helpful. They actually say conflict is an opportunity. So this whole thing around, avoid conflict at all costs, it's terrible, No, they say, no, it's an opportunity. An opportunity for what? The first thing they say, it's an opportunity to glorify God. Well, how do you do that? Well, right in the midst of it, you're saying to God, I trust you in this. I trust you. It's not where I want to be. It's not a good thing. It's not a likable thing, but I'm here. I trust you. I will obey you. I will search the scriptures and I will be reminded of what you call me to do. And, what a great thing that Paul said, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do everything for the glory of God. So that's one thing. In the midst of my conflict, I will seek to glorify God. The second thing that conflict is an opportunity to do is to serve other people. So one of the things we can do there is to say, I will use this to serve this person who, like me, is probably responding out of hurt and pain and brokenness. So if that's where they're coming from, one of the things I'm going to do is seek to love and serve and care for them, even in the midst of our conflict. So I think that's the second thing. So conflict is an opportunity to serve others. And thirdly, it's an opportunity to grow to be like Jesus. As I confess my sin, as I repent of wrong attitudes, as I seek to die to self and live to Christ, they are all ways that God is using to make me more like Jesus. So I think conflict is an opportunity to glorify God, to serve other people, and to grow to be like Christ. And I find that little framework just enormously helpful because, surprise, surprise, I cause and am involved in conflict every day.
I really like what you said there about pursuing peace within your community. And you said you'd done some work through a mob called Peacewise. I'm going to be trying to have a chat with someone from Peacewise later on in this series, this second season of the podcast, because we're pursuing this theme of how to handle conflict well in schools. One of the distinctions that has been made, and it came from my friend Jacob Skirk, he's been on the podcast, and look, I've got to tell you, this could be cynical, this might even start my own conflict with Skirker, but he can't have come up with this. He has to have heard it from somewhere. It is too good. It is too good. Maybe he wouldn't even have claimed to come up with it, but it's unreal. So he makes the distinction between being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. Have you heard of that distinction before?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, all right. So Skirker's done himself there. But no, look, the distinction is this. He said that a peacekeeper is someone who, in a sense, is always sweeping something under the rug. Mm-hmm. So they see the peace that the community has, and in some ways it can be an uneasy peace. There can be a bit of a standoff going on. And anytime anything sort of bubbles to the surface, it looks like it might rob that community of its peace, it just gets swept under the carpet. They just get rid of it. Don't address it. Don't ruin the peace. You've got this slight tension in the air, but the peacekeeper will be saying, well, that's better than an all-out blow-up. So we're going to continue to do that. Many of us know peacekeepers. Probably many of us are peacekeepers. We just don't want these things to come to a head. And the distinction he made was a peacekeeper, and the distinction he made was that a peacemaker is someone who actually has the skill and godly ability to bring those discussions out into the open. And you look at the grief or the loss or the frustration, you deal with it before the throne of God, you deal with it knowing that God and the heavenly hosts are watching you, and you actually restore genuine fellowship there. You actually bring people back together. The question is, do you think having a peacekeeper or being a peacekeeper, not letting anything really come to a head, do you think that sort of person is actually, despite all their good intentions, quite damaging for a community?
Yeah. And again, referring back to Peacewise, they call that peace faking. And so instead of peacemaking, we're actually peace faking. We're plastering over the cracks. We're avoiding hard conflicts. We're putting up with inappropriate behaviours. We're letting people treat us badly. But that's better than having a Barney, And so, really unhealthy. And really, as you said right at the beginning, what that does is it allows a festering of resentment, of poor relationship, which in most cases will and should really blow up into something because, you're actually denying the poor behaviour that's going on. You're denying the abuse that's there, even low-level abuse. I think your question's a good one. yeah, it might get you through to tomorrow, but it doesn't get you through to next year. Something's going to crack. So I think you're right. We're far better to actually get some biblical principles in place, have prayer and counselling with people we trust that say, help me to be a really effective and courageous peacemaker so that I can actually go into situations where conflict will come up, armed and ready to have a really good, godly response to this for the sake of true peace.
So peace is precious. We want to pursue it. We want to work hard for it, spend many calories trying to attain it. We want to pursue it in the right ways.
Yep.
What are some of the most common causes of conflict? What are the things within a school community that you think might be most likely to rob us of our peace? So just as you answer, think about perhaps you've got a new teacher going into a school.
Yep.
And you go, look, mate, these are the things that you got to watch out for.
Yeah. Well, look, to start with the generic, first of all, I mean, obviously conflict comes when there is a clash of wills. Think about that. I've upset my wife by saying that the light will be off by 10 o'clock because she's really tired. I've said, yeah, we'll, be in bed, the light will be off. And I've given her my word on that, but I actually want to catch the last 5 overs of the BBL, so I stay up late. It's really, a clash of wills. That it's at its core. We see that all the time. So I think that, in a really generic way, is what all that conflict is. It's two wills coming together and sparring. It's interesting when we think about that within the school context. The type of situation where I see, and it's predominantly low-level conflict. You really wouldn't sort of go to the Supreme Court on this one, but the low-level conflict is where we talk about managing change. And I think some schools do it very well, and I've seen it done well. But you've said already today that, you've got to spend a lot of time and energy. You've got to be well planned. You've got to be well thought out. You've got to understand people well and seek to be understood well by people. So I think any type of change management will be the bread and butter conflict situation for a school. So it could be a new curriculum. It could be, a new way of using a learning management system. It could be it could be the starting up of PLCs, whatever. I think that seems to be the place where people will resist the change based on their own desires, their own wills, even their own weaknesses and fears. Actually, I don't want to go into that. I'm not very good at technology, so therefore I don't feel comfortable with that. So I think that's really the space where we often see that. So I think that's more the school community. I'm talking there about colleagues. So anytime we've got change, I think you've actually got to be thinking, okay, how do we work this through well to minimise conflict, and where conflict does come, how will we work it through well? In regards to parents, I think it's a little bit different. I think where the conflict comes with educators and parents will be mostly around expectations of students, and again, I think, and it's often, it can often be an educator and a parent both holding very high expectations of students. They're just different. So I think often with a parent won't often come in because they're upset with the colour of the front fence. They're going to come in because, they don't think that their student has received the type of treatment that is due to them, and therefore they're upset, and therefore that's often where the conflict will come. So I think it's often around expectations of students. And then obviously, teacher-student, I think there, again, it's often to do with expectations about how the community will live or be. And so in each of those, if you think of the, managing of the organisation, particularly change, with parents managing of expectations, and with students setting rules and living by agreed expectations, they're all situations where you can be very proactive. We can be going in being really clear about things, listening well, consulting well. I love that Stephen Covey idea. Stephen Covey in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Habit 5 is seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I find that such a helpful proactive posture in any of those. If you think about a colleague who wants to come and say, listen, I'm really unhappy with this new timetabling system. I don't think it's equitable. I think, whatever. You think about the parent who's come in to have a discussion because they really feel that their student in grade 5 is not being catered for in the area of need. You think about yourself and a student who's coming to you upset because they felt that the assignment set didn't really allow them to shine or whatever. Any of those. If our starting point is let's seek first to understand, then to be understood, well, I think that even in itself, you can predict that there's going to be conflict, but there's actually a posture you can take. There's a proactive posture. I'm meeting with Mrs. Jones this afternoon. The first thing I'm going to do is seek to understand Mrs. Jones, and not just what's your problem, like, why is it a problem? Why do you think this is such a big issue? Where do you think things went wrong? That sort of stuff. Help me understand this. My personal experience is I want to get onto the front foot. I want to tell her. I want to read the rules. I want to, explain the situation. I want to tell her that her son is actually not an angel. ... Whereas the thing that seems to not peace fake, it's not about I'm gonna paper over the cracks here, but I am going to listen and seek to understand and make that my starting place. And I think in any of those situations, students, colleagues, or parents, that principle is actually a really helpful one.
And when it comes to conflict in a school community, another proverb that I found really illustrative is Proverbs 27:14. And the principle that I get from this proverb is that there can even be conflict where no one has sinned. And even when there's good intentions on both sides of the aisle, that often happens just because, not even just sin, but personal differences. So the proverb itself, Proverbs 27:14, it says, whoever blesses his neighbour with a loud voice rising early in the morning will be counted as cursing. So if I'm a huge fan of my neighbour, I love him to bits, and I get up outside his bedroom window in the morning and I say, God bless you, I hope you're sleeping well, have a fantastic day, may the glory of the Lord shine upon you. Yeah. He's going to be going, you idiot. So I've got up full of beans, full of love for my neighbour, but it's actually counted as a cursing. Like it's something that is received terribly. And I haven't necessarily sinned there, but it's just our different personalities, perhaps an unwise execution that might go into creating some conflict where there's two people who've just got nothing but the best of intentions.
I think, the key word that you said in that little sequence was wisdom. The thing we need in spades when dealing with conflict, yes, you need skill. Yes, you need to be trained. Yes, you need to have a good biblical framework. But above everything, you actually need wisdom, which we know starts by us fearing and revering the Lord. That's our starting posture. Before I get ready to have a crack at my neighbour, the first thing I've got to do is bend the knee and say to God, the only way through this is wisdom. The only way to have wisdom is to know and fear and love and serve you. This is where I start. Wisdom is enormously important, Paul, because I think what wisdom does is it tells me how to proceed. And sometimes, and you've given a good example of it, sometimes in conflict, the best way through is to have a laugh and a bit of a wisecrack and move on. Just someone does something that really gets up your nose. It could turn into conflict, but I'm choosing to use deft humour to get through it. Another one could be a quiet word on the side. Another one could be the opportunity to reiterate a school policy. Another one might be a mediation meeting. There's a whole range of choices that we can be making. The question is, which is the right one in this situation? And as you've alluded to, sometimes actually no one's done anything wrong. They've had a good heart. Maybe they've executed poorly. Maybe they were unwise. Maybe the timing was wrong. There's a whole range of things. And sometimes the best thing there is to not, go through a 3-hour mediation meeting. It's just to say, mate, love your blessing, hate the volume, let's think about that together, whatever. So I think wisdom is enormously helpful, particularly in situations where, there's no clean-cut right and wrong.
And loving our neighbour in those sorts of situations often means being really attentive, studying and learning about the people you're with. In a previous workplace that I've been a part of, we shared an office, and I like to go in early in the morning and just get things done. I like to make sure my emails are in good order. I like to do my big picture thinking, and then for that job I'd get into my tasks for the day. There'd be other people, and their way of approaching a workday was come in, how was your weekend? Did you get to catch up on Home and Away last night? And that was the way that they would slide. So they would gradually ease. So the sort of direction of our workflow, I'd start really high picture, big picture stuff, and then gradually, as the day goes on, I'd take my foot off the gas a bit. That's when once I'm sure I've gotten all the work done that I want to do, I can take some time off. I can have a bit of a yarn, talk about the cricket, so on. And other people, they're completely backwards. They're completely backwards. And that was a situation, again, that no one is sinning here. Me, try, but you end up with a pretty awkward situation. They're trying to talk to you, and you're going, man, leave me alone. And you're also having to then be a little bit rude. You're trying to turn away. You're trying to put your headphones on. You're buying a bigger set of headphones so everyone realises you're wearing your headphones, that sort of stuff. If you're not careful, if you don't approach it wisely, two people who just simply approach starting work differently can end up with some serious conflict.
But I think the word you used right at the beginning of that was really helpful about the way we love people. Just within the last 12 months, I had a situation where I could feel my hackles going up with a particular person. I could feel that, this person's getting up my nose, they're really irritating me, what do I do? Now, again, the wisdom could be, have a conversation, ignore them, change your routine. There's a whole range of things I could do. By God's prompting, I really sensed that God was saying to me, ask me for more love. And it was interesting. That's all I did. I didn't ever approach them. I didn't ever do anything differently. But God, in his mercy, gave me a deeper love for that person. And through that, conflict, I think, was avoided. So it was great. God, in his mercy, said, I know exactly what you need, Simon, and it's not bigger headphones or a bigger office. It's actually more love. And when that came, then everything else seemed to melt. So it was great.
So as we wrap up, let's just have a quick think about ways that conflict can be handled really poorly. So we'll all be in conflict. That's inevitable. It will be happening to us. And I'm almost thinking a bit of a mental checklist of yourself here. Yeah. And I'll kick it off because I've got one that I've found really important. If I'm in conflict, and again, it happens regularly in a school with a student or other staff members or a parent, one of the things I have to watch out for is assuming the motives of the other people. So it can be really easy to take the big leap from saying this is what this person's done and then leap right into and this is why they've done it. To use the example I just used before, Paul's turned his back on me and put on his headphones. That's because he's a disrespectful person who has no interest in workplace friendships, for example. That would be a case of going from what has happened straight to the motives. And I have to watch myself doing that as well. It's something that's so easy to do. We naturally want to understand other people. We naturally think of motives. And it can be really easy if our heart's not right before God, if we're not seeking a purity of heart, to automatically impute these negative motives to people. You can quite easily end up in a situation when that gets to the extreme end of the scale where everyone's against you all the time. It is a conspiracy, global conspiracy. Everyone's trying to have a crack at you. What else should people be wary of when they're in conflict? How can conflict be handled badly?
Yeah. A couple of things there, I think, and again, I arrive at this by reflecting on times I haven't handled conflict well. One of the things that I think happens when I don't handle conflict well is I am less aware of the emotional and even physical signs that I'm in conflict. And so I think being aware, when am I frustrated? When do I feel my blood pressure going up? When am I anxious about a meeting? I think being able to be aware of those sort of physical and emotional indicators is really, really important. So if you're ignoring that, I think that's going to exacerbate the situation. The second one, and it's really easy to do, but to make it all about me, and the assumption one's a good one. Here I am flogging myself for this person, and all they want to do is waste my time. Hardly ever, when I look back over my life, hardly ever has someone intentionally come in to make my life hard. Hardly ever. It's they've had at best they've not even thought about it. At best they sort of most of the time they've actually come to actually work for my good. It's just that we haven't hit it off. And so, very, very rare that someone would actually say, I'm going in today to make Simon's life hell, and that's my job for today. So the thing that exacerbates conflict is me making it about me, woe is me. The third thing, I think, is when particularly big conflict, when it becomes really twisted, knotted conflict, is not sharing it with others. I find it's really helpful, and that's not about going in saying, "Hey, I'm going to get you on my side. I'm going to get you batting for me." Can you help me? Can you help me think this through? Can you help me understand how I can have a better response? And the last couple of times when I've been in really long-term, twisted, detailed conflict, I've actually found it really helpful to go to someone. So, in response to your question, what makes it worse? Just keeping it to myself and just stewing on it and dwelling on it and just having it run through my head all day. That's actually going to really exacerbate the situation. So I think there are a few things that I'm becoming increasingly aware of. The final thing for me too is that sometimes, and I get to the point, I have got to the point in the past where it's a bit like a mosquito bite. You shouldn't scratch it, but gosh, when you scratch it, it feels good. And it's almost like, no, I'm not letting go of this conflict. I'm actually most satisfied when I'm just stewing on this person. So actually being able to just let the thing go, whatever that means, actually working to a point of resolving it, and there's always cost in that, but resolving it and not just saying, I'm most satisfied when I'm actually living in misery, and I love that. I remember that little saying that people have, which is, unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It never happens. I'm the one who's dying. I'm the one who's shriveling up. Got to remember that.
There's also a sense, and I've seen this from your example, where prayer is incredibly important. Prayer is incredibly important when going through conflict, taking it before the throne of God. There's the old Martin Luther quote. I think I heard it first from you. He said, sometimes I've got so much to do that I have to pray for 3 hours in the morning. So when we have conflict, it's almost like a part-time job. There's extra stuff on our plate. And what that means is not that there's less time for our spiritual disciplines, less time for prayer, but that there's actually more time for that. We need our roots to sink more deeply into the ground because we're going to be buffeted by all kinds of winds. But there's a very specific piece of advice that I received, which is about actually how you pray when you're in conflict, because it can be really easy, if you're not careful, to pray in a way that makes it worse. So if I am praying and saying, "Dear Lord, please help me, I've got this conflict with Jack in my office," he just doesn't realise how good my work is in the morning. He has no understanding of these sorts of things. Lord, you know how productive I get. And you know that he just completely ignores. What am I doing? I'm stewing. I'm meditating on my own sorrows. It's a big pity party before the throne. Yeah. And there's actually a sense in which if you're caught up in that, it makes a lot of sense to just meditate on other scriptures. Start praying through some Psalms. Yep. Come before the throne of God, but don't do it in a way that's just simply rehashing every single wrong anyone has done to you or the exact conflict that you're going through, because that there can be a sense in which that's actually going to be unhelpful for you. Prayer is good, but we have to actually watch how we pray when we're coming before God's throne in the midst of conflict.
Mm-hmm. One of the privileges that I've had in the last couple of years, and I think it would be fair to say that certainly 2020 and 2021 were some of the most challenging personally and corporately I'd lived through. And some of the fruit of those 2 years was a greater awareness of and delving into the process of lament. And I'm certainly using a lament-like framework when I'm in conflict now. I'm praying that much more. And the 3 steps are pretty simple. The first is just to be really honest with God, saying, God, Barry and I really seem to be in conflict. I can see it's upsetting. Last time we were together, he was obviously very anxious and ended up yelling. It's really eating me up. I can't sleep at night. So you're praying. This is the reality. The second thing is I find to then confess to God. I said right at the beginning that God has dealt with our greatest conflict, our enmity with him. So it's a safe bet to say that part of the conflict with Barry will be me. So to actually confess that, and sometimes I can tell you exactly what it is. It happened when I actually was jealous of Barry and I said something out of turn and then he got head up and whatever. So I can confess that. If I can't think of a specific, I can just say, God, I know in my brokenness and fallenness that I will have contributed and I'm really sorry. And then to have the third part of that prayer being what God promises for us. And so we actually end up starting in confession, starting in stating the reality, moving into confession, and thirdly, moving into faith statements. God, you promise, ... and praise in that as well. And so we actually end up at a point of praising God for who he is and what he promises to do with my conflict. And I've found, so it's similar to, but not exactly the same as a lament process. But it's helpful. I find it really helpful because it moves me from where I'm at to where God has called me to be in Christ, and I just find that enormously helpful. So yeah, you're exactly right. That type of praying. I mean, I think the other praying that God calls us to in conflict is to be praying for the one we are in conflict with. You know, the scriptures talk about praying for our enemies. Well, possibly right at this moment, I may consider Barry an enemy. So God's already told me what I'm to do for Barry. I'm to pray for him. So get praying. And it's amazing how that melts your heart when you actually start praying for Barry. Because the first thing it does is it causes me to see him and I before the throne, as opposed to just him and I before the throne. Then I actually want to start praying for him. And then when I actually see him, I really do have a changed heart for him.
Well, this has been a fantastic first foray into the idea of conflict. As I said earlier, this is something I want to be thinking a lot about in 2023, only because I think it impacts our schools greatly. I mean, you look at teacher churn, losing teachers, losing families, you look at bad culture, all these sorts of things are often the result of conflict poorly managed. And so I really have a heart, in order to see Christian schools flourish, to actually be thinking about together, how can we manage this conflict well? So it's been a delight, Simon, to have you on and to talk about this with you. I look forward to talking to you about this later on in the year. Is there anything else you'd like to add before you take off?
Only to commend you on identifying this as something that's really core to community. We said right at the beginning, conflict will always be there. So if we accept that, and not everyone will, but if we do, and I do, then what are we going to do about that? How do we respond to that in light of God's goodness and in light of the work of the cross? How will we respond to the inevitable in a way that is both faithful and fruitful?
It's been a pleasure. Simon, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you later on in the year.
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure.